On May 26, 1940, the British government faced the greatest military disaster in centuries. Over 400,000 British and French soldiers were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk in northern France, their backs to the sea, surrounded by German panzer divisions. The port was destroyed. The harbor was in ruins. Luftwaffe bombers filled the skies. And the Nazi army, which had swept through France in just 6 weeks, was closing in for the kill. Prime Minister Winston Churchill expected to lose the entire British expeditionary force. Military planners hoped they might rescue 20,000 to 30,000 men before the inevitable surrender. The rest would be killed or captured. Britain would lose its only trained army. The nation would be defenseless against invasion. Hitler would win the war. But then something extraordinary happened. Something that nobody had planned for. Something that would become known as the miracle of Dunkirk. Over the next 9 days, from May 26 to June 4, 1940, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from those beaches. They were rescued by a hastily assembled fleet of over 800 vessels, from Royal Navy destroyers to fishing boats, from pleasure yachts to Thames barges. Civilian boat owners, many of them ordinary men who'd never been in combat, sailed their small craft across the English Channel into a war zone to save soldiers they'd never met. This is the story of Operation Dynamo. The story of how Britain refused to surrender when defeat seemed certain. The story of courage in the face of impossible odds. And the story of those little ships that became legends. To understand Dunkirk, we need to understand how Britain found itself in such desperate circumstances. When World War II began in September 1939 after Germany invaded Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany. But for 8 months, nothing much happened. The French sat behind their supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the French-German border. The British sent the British Expeditionary Force to France, over 400,000 soldiers. And everyone waited. This period became known as the Phony War. Then on May 10, 1940, the Phony War ended with devastating speed. Germany launched a massive attack through the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. But this wasn't where the French expected the attack. The main German thrust came through the Ardennes forest, which the French had dismissed as impassable for tanks. The Germans proved them catastrophically wrong. Panzer divisions, German armored tank units, smashed through the Ardennes and into France. They moved with incredible speed, bypassing French defensive positions, cutting communication lines, creating chaos and confusion. The French command structure collapsed. Units lost contact with headquarters. Nobody knew where the Germans were or where they were going. Within days, the German spearhead reached the English Channel, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and large numbers of French troops in northern France and Belgium. The Allied armies tried to break through, tried to reconnect their lines, but every counterattack failed. The German advance was relentless. By May 20th, the situation was hopeless. The British, French, and Belgian forces were trapped in a shrinking pocket of land around the French port of Dunkirk. The only way out was the sea. Lord Gort, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, immediately saw that evacuation was the only option. If they stayed and fought, they'd be annihilated. If they surrendered, Britain would lose its army and the war would be over. Churchill gave the order. Operation Dynamo would begin. The Royal Navy would evacuate as many men as possible. Nobody had any illusions about the chances of success. This wasn't a planned withdrawal. This was a panicked retreat in the face of overwhelming enemy force. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay was put in charge of the operation. He worked from naval headquarters in Dover Castle, literally under the castle in tunnels and rooms that had been carved into the White Cliffs. From there, he coordinated what would become one of the most complex rescue operations in military history. The challenges were enormous. Dunkirk's port facilities had been destroyed by German bombing. Large ships couldn't get close to the beaches because the water was too shallow. The beaches themselves stretched for miles, flat sand with virtually no cover from air attack. And all around, the German army was closing in. Ramsay knew he needed more ships. Many more. The Royal Navy had destroyers, but not enough. He needed vessels that could operate in shallow water, that could get right up to the beaches and load soldiers directly. So on May 20th, even before the operation officially began, the British Admiralty started calling for small boats. The message went out across southeast England. All boats with shallow drafts were needed immediately. Owners were asked to volunteer their vessels or have them requisitioned by the Ministry of Shipping. Agents scoured the Thames, the harbors, the marinas, looking for anything that could float and carry men. The response was extraordinary. Within 24 hours, over 700 small craft had gathered at Ramsgate and other ports along the southeast coast. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, Thames barges, lifeboats, ferries, tugboats. Some were crewed by Royal Navy personnel, others by merchant sailors, and many others by their civilian owners, ordinary British men who volunteered to sail into a war zone. These became known as the little ships of Dunkirk. Vessels ranging from less than 15 feet to over 100 feet in length. Some were seaworthy ocean-going craft. Others were riverboats that had never been in open water before. But they all had one thing in common. They could get close to shore and carry soldiers. Operation Dynamo officially began on the evening of May 26, 1940. The first ships arrived at Dunkirk to find chaos. Thousands of soldiers crowded the beaches, standing in long lines stretching into the water. The town was burning, great columns of black smoke rising into the sky. German artillery shelled the beaches periodically. Luftwaffe bombers appeared overhead, dropping bombs, strafing the beaches with machine gun fire. On that first day, only 7,669 soldiers were evacuated. It was a disaster. At this rate, it would take months to evacuate everyone, and they didn't have months. They had days, maybe a week at most, before the Germans overran the perimeter. But then something changed. Captain William Tennant, the senior naval officer ashore, made a brilliant observation. There was an east mole, a concrete and wooden pier that extended nearly a mile into deeper water. It had been built as a breakwater, not a dock, and nobody had considered using it for loading soldiers. Tennant realized it could work. Ships could tie up alongside the mole and soldiers could walk directly aboard. It would be much faster than wading out to boats from the beaches. The mole became the primary evacuation point. Destroyers pulled alongside and loaded soldiers as quickly as they could. Hundreds of men would board each ship, then the ship would cast off and race back across the channel to England, where the soldiers would disembark and the ship would immediately return for another load. Meanwhile, on the beaches, the little ships went to work. They couldn't carry many men at a time, maybe 10 or 20 or 50 depending on size. But they could operate in water too shallow for larger vessels. They'd pull up as close as possible, and soldiers would wade out, sometimes up to their necks in water, and climb aboard. Then the little ships would ferry them to the larger naval vessels waiting offshore. The soldiers had been fighting for weeks. They were exhausted, hungry, demoralized. Many had no weapons, having discarded them during the retreat. They'd stand in lines on the beach for hours, sometimes days, waiting their turn. German planes would appear and they'd scatter, diving for cover, then reform the lines when the attack passed. The discipline was remarkable. These men had just been defeated in battle. Their army had been routed. They had every reason to panic. But they maintained order, formed queues, waited their turns. Officers organized them by unit. When a boat came in, the men at the front of the line would wade out and board. Then the line would move forward. The little ships made trip after trip. One boat, a pleasure yacht called Sundowner, was commanded by Charles Lightoller, who'd been the second officer on the Titanic when it sank in 1912. Lightoller, now 66 years old, insisted on taking his own yacht across to Dunkirk. He and his eldest son Roger, along with a sea scout named Gerald Ashcroft, sailed to Dunkirk and brought back 127 soldiers packed so tightly they could barely move. Another small boat, a fishing vessel called Tamzine, was less than 15 feet long, one of the smallest boats in the entire operation. But she made the crossing and rescued soldiers. The Medway Queen, a paddle steamer that had been converted to a minesweeper, made 7 trips to Dunkirk. She rescued over 7,000 soldiers total. On one crossing, her paddle wheels churned up phosphorescence in the water, creating a glowing wake that made her an easy target for German bombers. The crew devised oil bags to pour oil on the water and break up the luminescence. Another time, soot in her funnel caught fire, and they had to pour water down to extinguish it while the engine room crew complained about being drowned. Royal Daffodil, a passenger ship, evacuated 7,461 soldiers in 5 trips between May 28 and June 2. On her last trip, she was attacked by 6 German aircraft. A bomb penetrated 2 decks and blew a hole below the waterline, but somehow she limped back to port. The RNLI, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, sent lifeboats. The Prudential from Ramsgate towed 8 small Thames wherries to Dunkirk. These tiny river boats ferried soldiers from the beach to the lifeboat. In the first night alone, they rescued 800 men. 3 of the wherries were lost to enemy action, but the work continued. The Lord Southborough from Margate, crewed by coxswain Edward Parker and his 2 sons, made the crossing under tow to conserve fuel. When they arrived at Dunkirk, Parker said it was like hell. Shells bursting, fires raging, German submarines in the shadows. But they loaded over 500 men onto the destroyer HMS Icarus in one trip. For 9 days, this continued. Ships crossing the channel, loading soldiers, returning, crossing again. Some ships made a single trip. Others made multiple journeys. The Royal Navy lost 6 destroyers sunk and 19 damaged. Over 200 small craft were sunk or damaged. For every 7 men rescued, 1 was left behind as a prisoner of war. The weather helped. The seas were unusually calm for late May. If there had been storms, the little boats couldn't have operated. The wind blew from the east, pushing smoke from burning Dunkirk across the beaches, providing some cover from air attack. Low clouds limited Luftwaffe bombing runs. The Luftwaffe did attack, repeatedly. Stukas, German dive bombers, screamed down on the beaches and ships. Messerschmitt fighters strafed the beaches with machine guns. But the Royal Air Force fought back. Spitfires and Hurricanes engaged the German aircraft over Dunkirk. The soldiers on the beach couldn't always see the dogfights happening above them, hidden by clouds, and some felt the RAF had abandoned them. But the RAF lost 145 aircraft protecting the evacuation. On the beaches, French troops fought a rearguard action, holding defensive positions to keep the Germans at bay while the evacuation continued. At Lille, 40,000 French soldiers of the First Army fought a desperate delaying action against 7 German divisions, 3 of them armored. They held out from May 28 to 31, giving precious time for the evacuation. Most of those French soldiers were captured when Lille fell, but their sacrifice saved thousands of British and French troops at Dunkirk. As the days passed, the numbers grew. May 27, 76-69 evacuated. May 28, 17800. May 29, 47300. May 30th, 53800. May 31st, 68,000. June 1st, 64400. The pace was accelerating. Ships were making faster turnarounds. The mole was working brilliantly. The little ships ferried constantly. It was working. Against all odds, it was actually working. But there was still a question nobody wanted to ask. Why hadn't the Germans attacked more aggressively? Why had they given the Allies time to evacuate? The perimeter around Dunkirk was thin, held by exhausted troops with limited ammunition. A determined German assault would break through easily. The answer lies with Adolf Hitler himself. On May 24, Hitler had ordered the panzer divisions to halt their advance outside Dunkirk. For 3 days, the German armor sat idle while the Allies reinforced the perimeter and began the evacuation. Historians still debate why Hitler gave this order. Some say he wanted to preserve his tanks for the coming offensive against the rest of France. Some say Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring convinced him the Air Force alone could destroy the trapped armies. Some suggest Hitler wanted to let the British escape as a humanitarian gesture, hoping it would bring Britain to the negotiating table for peace. Whatever the reason, it was a catastrophic mistake. Those 3 days allowed the Allies to establish defenses and begin the evacuation. When the German ground forces finally resumed their attack, it was too late. The evacuation was in full swing and the defensive perimeter held. On June 2, the last British troops were evacuated from Dunkirk. The rear guard holding the perimeter was now almost entirely French. These brave French soldiers held their positions knowing they'd likely be captured, sacrificing their freedom so others could escape. On the night of June 3 and morning of June 4, the final evacuations took place. French soldiers ran from their positions to the beaches and boats. Thousands more were rescued. At dawn on June 4th, German troops entered Dunkirk. The evacuation was over. The final tally was staggering. 338,226 soldiers had been rescued. Over 215,000 British and 123,000 French and Belgian troops. Churchill had expected to save at most 30,000. Instead, they'd saved more than 10 times that number. The British Expeditionary Force had lost its equipment, its tanks and trucks and artillery, but the men survived. Britain still had an army. Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons on June 4, 1940. His speech is one of the most famous in British history. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. He called it a colossal military disaster. He reminded them that wars are not won by evacuations. France was still falling. The battle ahead would be long and brutal. But then he spoke words that would echo through history, words that defined British resolve in their darkest hour. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. The miracle of Dunkirk became a defining moment for Britain. It should have been a story of defeat, of humiliation, of disaster. Instead, it became a story of courage, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of refusal to give up when all seemed lost. The little ships became symbols of that spirit. They represented something quintessentially British, the idea that when the nation calls, ordinary people respond. Fishermen and yacht owners and pleasure boat captains, sailing into danger to save soldiers they'd never met. Not because they had to. Because it was the right thing to do. The term Dunkirk spirit entered the English language. It means showing courage and unity in the face of difficulty, refusing to accept defeat, pulling together when times are darkest. Even today, more than 80 years later, when Britain faces a crisis, people invoke the Dunkirk spirit. The Association of Dunkirk Little Ships was established in 1965 on the 25th anniversary of the evacuation. The organization works to preserve the memory of the little ships and maintain those vessels that still exist. Every 5 years, the association organizes a commemorative voyage. The surviving little ships, escorted by the Royal Navy, sail across the Channel to Dunkirk, retracing the route they took in 1940. In 2020, on the 80th anniversary, 66 little ships made the crossing. In 2025, on the 85th anniversary, they sailed again. Each voyage is a reminder, a connection to history. The veterans are gone now. Duncan McInnes, the last known Dunkirk naval veteran, died in May 2025 at age 105, just days before the anniversary. Ian Gilbert of the Association of Dunkirk Little Ships said the little ships themselves are now the veterans, the living link to that moment in history. The ships are maintained lovingly by their owners. Sundowner, Charles Lightollers' motor yacht, is being restored. Tamzine, the tiny fishing boat, is preserved by the Imperial War Museum. Medway Queen underwent extensive restoration and is now a museum ship. These vessels, some over a century old, are kept seaworthy so they can continue to sail, continue to tell their story. Films have been made about Dunkirk. The 2017 film Dunkirk, directed by Christopher Nolan, brought the story to a new generation. The movie used some of the actual little ships in the filming, and many of the owners volunteered their boats to be part of the production. Seeing those vessels on screen, knowing they were the real boats that had been there in 1940, gave the film an authenticity that nothing else could provide. But perhaps the most important legacy of Dunkirk isn't the films or the commemorations or even the preservation of the little ships. It's the lesson the evacuation taught. That defeat doesn't have to mean surrender. That ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage. That nations don't fall because of military setbacks. They fall when their people give up hope. Britain in June 1940 had every reason to give up. France fell 3 weeks after Dunkirk. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Invasion seemed imminent. The situation was desperate. But because 338,000 soldiers had been saved from Dunkirk, Britain had an army. Because those soldiers survived, Britain could keep fighting. And because Britain kept fighting, Eventually, with American and Soviet help, the Allies won the war. The soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk went on to fight in North Africa, in Italy, in the D-Day landings in Normandy, across Europe all the way to Germany. The British Expeditionary Force that should have been destroyed in May 1940 instead became the core of the army that liberated Europe. Every one of those soldiers owed their lives to Operation Dynamo. To Vice Admiral Ramsay coordinating from his tunnels under Dover Castle. To Captain Tennant realizing the mole could be used for loading. To the Royal Navy crews manning destroyers and running the gauntlet of bombs and torpedoes. To the merchant sailors and lifeboat crews and fishermen. And most of all, to those civilians who owned the little ships. Who heard the call and responded. Who left their families and their normal lives and sailed their boats across the channel into a war zone. Who made trip after trip, ferrying soldiers, dodging bombs, watching ships sink around them, and kept going anyway. Charles Lightoller was 66 years old when he took Sundowner to Dunkirk. He'd survived the Titanic sinking 28 years earlier. He could have stayed home. Nobody would have blamed him. But when his yacht was requisitioned, he insisted on commanding her himself, and he brought back 127 men. The owners of the little ships didn't think of themselves as heroes. Many of them never talked about what they did. They saw themselves as ordinary people doing what had to be done. That's what makes them extraordinary. The miracle of Dunkirk wasn't really a miracle. It was the result of courage, determination, improvisation, and luck. The calm seas helped. The east wind helped. Hitler's halt order helped. The French rearguard fighting to the last helped. The RAF fighting overhead helped. Captain Tennant's idea about the mole helped. But mostly it was people. People refusing to give up. People doing jobs they'd never trained for under conditions they'd never imagined. People sailing boats in water too rough for rivercraft. People standing in lines on beaches while bombs fell. People fighting holding actions knowing they'd be captured. People coordinating a massive operation from underground rooms with 1940s technology and limited information. The evacuation of Dunkirk saved an army. But more than that, it saved Britain's will to fight. If those men had been lost, if the British Expeditionary Force had been destroyed or captured, British morale would have collapsed. There would have been enormous pressure to negotiate peace with Germany. Churchill might have fallen from power. Britain might have left the war. Instead, the soldiers came home. Battered, defeated in battle, but alive. And Britain looked at those 338,000 men and saw not defeat but deliverance. They saw that even in the darkest moment, survival was possible. Victory was possible. That spirit, that refusal to accept defeat, that determination to keep fighting no matter what, became Britain's greatest weapon in the years ahead. Through the Blitz, when German bombers pounded British cities night after night, Britain endured. Through the dark days when invasion seemed certain, Britain prepared to fight. Through the long years before America entered the war, Britain fought on alone. And it all traces back to those 9 days in May and June 1940. To the beaches of Dunkirk. To the little ships crossing the channel. To the men standing in lines in the water. To the soldiers holding the perimeter. To everyone who played a part in the miracle. The story of Dunkirk reminds us that history turns on moments. That the outcome of an entire war can depend on decisions made in hours or days. That individual acts of courage can change the fate of nations. If Hitler hadn't halted the panzers, the evacuation might have failed. If the weather hadn't been calm, the little ships couldn't have operated. If Captain Tennant hadn't thought of using the mole, the evacuation would have been too slow. If the civilian boat owners hadn't volunteered, there wouldn't have been enough vessels. If the French hadn't held at Lille and around Dunkirk, the Germans would have broken through. Every piece mattered. Every person mattered. From Churchill giving the order to the unknown soldier standing in line in the water waiting his turn. From Vice Admiral Ramsay in his command post to the civilian yacht owner sailing his pleasure boat into a war zone. Everyone played a part. And because they did, Britain survived. The war continued. Years later, Allied forces landed at Normandy and began the liberation of Europe. Germany was defeated. The nightmare of Nazi tyranny ended. And it all happened because in May 1940, at Dunkirk, Britain refused to surrender. The little ships still sail. Every 5 years, they cross the channel, retracing the route. Old boats, lovingly maintained, crewed by people who weren't born when the evacuation happened. They sailed to honor the memory of those who were there, to keep the story alive, to remind us what ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to give up. Winston Churchill was right. Wars are not won by evacuations. Dunkirk was a defeat, a retreat, a disaster. Britain had been driven from the continent. France would fall. Dark days lay ahead. But Dunkirk was also deliverance. It was proof that even in the worst circumstances, hope remains. That courage can triumph over fear. That ordinary people can be heroes. And that nations survive not because of their weapons or their strategies, but because of the spirit of their people. That's the miracle of Dunkirk. Not that 338,000 men were saved, though that itself is remarkable, but that in the saving of those men, Britain saved itself, saved its army, saved its morale, saved its will to fight, and in doing so, changed the course of history. The little ships sailed into legend, and Britain sailed on, through darkness, toward victory.